Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Esplin. I'm a product manager at Evernym, and this is a recording I want to post on the Evernym YouTube channel. I'm doing a training for the Evernym product team on open source product strategy. And I've got my colleague Tyler Ruff on this. We're going to talk between us, and then we'll post the conversation if it turns out worthwhile. So that's the plan. Goal is for this to take less than a half hour. So I presented at the Internet Identity Workshop last week, the remote IAW on open source product strategy. There were a bunch of other product managers there, and I always love talking this stuff, so I took the opportunity. But the key thing to recognize is that we're going to provide some context, and then we'll talk about some practicalities. I'm assuming a certain base level of understanding about open source and about self-sovereign identity, the niche that we're playing in at Evernym. I did a presentation on this at SSI Meetup last November. No, I guess it was a year and a half ago, November of 2018. You can find it there. It was webinar 16, and that one I go through like what is open source, what is the value to, how did it evolve over time, and I went through what is self-sovereign identity and why is it useful, and then why owning your tools is so important in a self-sovereign identity ecosystem, owning the applications that host that identity. Let me make that a little bigger. So that was what that context might be useful for people. Tyler, is Zoom cutting off the slide, or is it sharing the whole slide?
It's sharing the whole thing.
Okay, it thinks it's cutting off. I don't know why. Okay, so in the open source software movement, there's the concept of free software, meaning free is in freedom. Libre software, because people got confused between free is in price and free is in freedom. And open source software, which is a business-oriented packaging of free software. We're going to treat all of these the same for this conversation and call them all open source. So just so people are aware of that. And it's important to recognize a lot of people act like open source is something you have to do. It's an ethical requirement. That's the basis of the free software movement. And that's not the way we're going to do it for this conversation. This is about business. And so we're going to look at we're going to analyze the options we have and pick the ones that's right for our product. Now, it is good to recognize that open source is a public good in economics terms. You're generating a resource that can be used by the world, and that's good. That's a benefit for the world. So that's nice, and it makes you feel good as you do it. And it's good karma is in ethics because you're making the world a better place, and that's nice. And it's also important to recognize that there is a tribe of open source enthusiasts that will try to enforce norms. And if you violate the norms of that tribe, they will get grumpy with you. And you should keep that in mind as you figure out how to execute on an open source product strategy. But beyond that, we're going to look at this as what is the analysis of how we want to run an open source strategy. The free software movement started in the late 70s, early 80s with Richard Stallman. He founded the Free Software Foundation. He wrote the GNU operating system and lots of open source kernels, lots of open source projects like Emacs. And he was very concerned about the ethical framework of free software. And he said, look, there's 4 freedoms we need to preserve. And since we're developers, since we're programmers, we start counting at 0. We need to be able to run the program for any purpose. We need to be able to study how the program works. We need to be able to redistribute the program. And we need to be able to improve the program and redistribute the improvements. And if a software package is licensed in a way that respects these freedoms for the user, then it's free software. And if it violates these freedoms, then it is not. And free software is good for democracy. It's good for equality. It's good for collaboration and society. We want to love our neighbor and collaborate together and share. And that's why we need free software. So it's a very ethical framework for this movement. And it's great. It was very powerful. His team produced tons of software that we all use today. The core of the GNU Linux operating system, not the kernel, but most of the main programs at the center of that system and lots of other packages were created by Richard Stallman or people who ascribe to these principles and were worried about preserving these freedoms. And it's also important to recognize that because we're worried about the ethics of freedom, the fairest thing to do is to license the software in a way that preserves those freedoms for the end user. So free software licenses are often reciprocal. They say, I have to, if I use the code under this license, I have to share my contributions under the same license. I have to give as I received. And these share alike licenses, it's a brilliant copy hack, a brilliant legal hack. It takes the terms of copyright that is usually used to restrict distribution of software and enforces the redistribution of software. So Richard Stallman calls it copyleft. And that's really powerful for creating a democratic ecosystem around software, because everybody can contribute, everybody benefits in the same way. Nobody can turn that proprietary if there's multiple copyright holders that all can enforce their claim on the code. It's also fairly challenging for businesses, because businesses, when they use software that's under that kind of share-alike license, they've given up certain rights on how they'll run their business. They have to reshare. And so businesses get really nervous about the share-alike provisions of free software. Now, not all free software licenses have that share-alike provision, but it's part of that ethos. And businesses are also nervous about the idea that software's free, as in, how do I make money? How do I run my business? And so in the early 90s, a developer named Linus Torvalds, a college student in computer science, he wrote the core of the Linux kernel. He wrote the Linux kernel that was the core of that GNU Linux operating system, became the core of the GNU Linux operating system that Richard Stallman was trying to build. He open sourced this stuff under the GPL, which is the share-alike license that the rest of the GNU software is under. But is spun, and he was shocked by how fast people adopting contribute to it. He and his associates, they weren't as worried about the ethical implications of free software. They were more interested in the fun that comes with open source engineering, with collaborating, with not solving the same problem more than once, with not reinventing the wheel, with working on interesting stuff. And other people who did value the ethical implications of free software, they also recognize that businesses wouldn't adopt it if they were mired in these decisions and worried about the term free and things like that. So they started a group called Open Source. The Open Source Initiative went and said, look, let's take those 4 freedoms, let's make them a little more detailed so we close some loopholes so you get the 10 freedoms. And let's call this the open source definition, and it's trademarked. And a license is open source if it has been approved by the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative approves software that fulfills these 10 freedoms, approves software licenses that fulfill these 10 freedoms. So a lot of companies, a lot of communities, a lot of people bicker, is it open source, is it not open source? That's really kind of simple, it's really kind of silly, because if the license of the software is an OSI, an Open Source Initiative approved license, then by definition, it's an open source project. That's just the way it works, because open source is a trademark. You can argue about a lot of other things, but open source is a trademark, and if you're using an OSI approved license, then you have an open source business model.
So Richard, are we to understand that, like you said, saying your project, or when you're looking at a vendor, it's not an on or off switch or a checkbox, are your products open sourced or not? It's much more nuanced than that. And that oftentimes when people are asking that question, they may not be realizing, are they asking that question with a capital O, capital S, capital I?
Yeah, there's a variety of these models, and that's a great segue. Actually, I'm going to put that on hold. We'll talk about a variety of those models in a minute. But there's a core of saying the code I'm distributing is either open source or not. It's either under an OSI license or not. The role that code plays in the rest of my business can run a spectrum from, hey, we're a proprietary business and we just happen to generate some open source code, to everything we do is under an open source license. And that spectrum causes a lot of arguments about where business wants to fall on that spectrum. And so you're exactly right that when you talk about your business model, it's not a simple on or off, but when you talk about an individual project, the code is either open sourced or it isn't. And just because you can see the code doesn't mean it's open source. If the license is not an OSI approved license, it is not open source, even if you can see the code. Does that make sense?
I think that's an important clarification for the audience. So, and because that will play in here in a few minutes.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk about why you want a business around open source. Open source provides a lot of value to customers. So as an enterprise, saying we're going to be open source gives it that OSI license, those freedoms that Richard Stallman described, it changes the way business works because you've given rights to your user, you've equalized that, you've brought that playing field much closer between you and your client, so that your client has a lot of leverage because they've got rights in the license. So you as a business have to focus more on support. The client gets vendor dependence, a certain mitigation against risk that you as a vendor might cause, an improved negotiating position that they can often leverage for a lower price. Frequently, because of these things and because of the ancillary social benefit of open source, a lot of clients will have a policy that says we prefer open source software. And so that compliance is a benefit. I was surprised when I started doing commercial open source, how many clients picked our products just because there was no sales cycle, because they could just go give it a shot and then figure out when they've proven it works, then they could get budget. So that fast adoption proved to be really valuable. And of course, we talked about the ancillary social benefit. Now, there's some things that open source has a reputation for that isn't necessarily true, though it is often true. That lower price, not necessarily true. If I'm giving more freedoms with this package, it should have more value to the user, it might have a higher price. Better security, a well-maintained project probably has better security because more people are looking at it, but that's not true by default. Faster innovation, again, if I'm accepting pull requests and I'm if I'm a maintainer who contributes, who collaborates with people, I'll get better innovation, but that depends on how projects run. Greater transparency, interoperability, those benefits of open source are often true, but it requires a healthy project to bring those benefits. Now, as a business, we look at open source because we want to grow the ecosystem we sell in. We're driving adoption of standards. We want to foster innovation, get third-party contributions, gain brand recognition, grow customer goodwill, be an on-ramp to our paid offerings, increase by commoditizing the open source tiers of the stack. It makes it harder for other people to come into our space. All these benefits are why we as a business would be interested in following this model compared to a traditional proprietary model. It's a bit more complicated. It's a bit higher risk, but once you figure it out, it provides a solid foundation that makes it hard to compete against you. Now, I did want to make one comment to your point. Is an open source project? Well, actually, I have a slide on this. So let's talk about the balance, the strategic tools that you can apply to your open source business model. Now, people often talk about pure open source and open core. Open core says I have some things that are open and some things that are closed. Most open source business models today are open core, and you're striking this balance between growing that ecosystem. I want a strong enough open source project that people want to adopt, people want to pay. Sorry, people want to adopt, people want to use, and then I want enough things that are proprietary that cause people to say, yes, let's upsell. Let's buy the additional services and become customers. And if you strike this right, then the two work together and you have a very powerful business model. If you lean too much on the adoption side, then you'll invest a lot in R&D and you won't get a lot of sales. You'll have a hard time improving the project. If you invest too much in keeping things proprietary, then nobody will adopt and you've just got a traditional proprietary business, except you've gone and licensed all your code for free, which it makes it harder to compete against your proprietary competitors. So we're trying to strike that balance in that open core model, and there's a tension there. It's funny, the sales team definitely feels the challenges of not enough upsell. The marketing team often feels the challenges of not enough adoption. The engineering team is usually really keen on the open source everything side. The accounting team and the team working with investors are often really keen on the let's show how it's defensible side. So these stakeholders you've got to manage as you go through the process. And so that creates this spectrum of business models. You've got the Red Hats of the world, pure play open source, the Clouderas, Hadoop Clouderas, the new Clouderas. You have, on the other side, companies that don't actually have an open source business model, but their source code's available. Atlassian at least they used to give all their source code to their customers. It was public, but it was a proprietary license. And in between, you have these models where parts are open, parts are closed, and you're trying to figure out how to upsell to the proprietary features. Pure play models are great because they're very focused as a business. You don't have that constant tension. You've made your decision. You're going to be pure play, but you've got to have another way to get revenue. It's got to come from support or hosting or training. It's tangential to the bits, the source code, and the artifacts you're selling that you distribute. You might give a product license, but your stickiness with the customer comes through these ancillary services. And so if you're going to go pure play, you gotta figure that out. So there's a variety of licenses that you can leverage to help you with this model. On the open source licenses, Bruce Perens, he was one of the creators of the open source definition. He talks about 3 licenses. You have your gift licenses, like your Apache. That's great for, it says, do whatever you want, just don't sue me. And there's patent license clarifications in there too, specifically in Apache. So it's really easy to say, hey, let's collaborate together. You can put this in your proprietary product. I'm fine with that. We can all work together. Let's drive adoption of the standard. Let's build a common code base that we can interoperate on. The GPL license is the free software share-alike license. It's a sharing with rules license. It's reciprocal. It says, if I give this to you, anything you build with it has to be open source under the same license. And that's really nice for, hey, look, nobody's going to commercialize this. I, as a small contributor, I'm not benefiting your giant company business model. But at the same time, as a business, you think, if I use this code, I'm constrained in what business model I can pick. And so there's that tension. Sharing with rules is often used by companies that want to follow a dual licensing strategy. If I require all contributors to my code base to sign over a license to the copyright, then I have the exclusive copyright, then I have a copyright of the entire code base, and I'm the exclusive entity that does that. That has that copyright to the entire code base. I can relicense under a proprietary license. And so I can open source under the GPL, give my users those rights and benefits, those freedoms. But other people can't commercialize in the same way I can, because I can offer proprietary licenses to people that don't want to use the GPL, and other people can't. And so that dual licensing strategy is often used to build that defensible business and still give rights and freedoms to your user and still have an ecosystem of contributors. Some contributors say, oh, that's not fair though. You have rights that I don't have because you can relicense, you can build your business and I can't. And that's true, but in most of these cases, nobody else is investing in that software niche without being able to show that return on investment. And so it generates net more open source. And then the third is the in-between license, the licensed GPL, the lesser or limited GPL, where it says this doesn't apply to everything you do with the source code I give you, but any changes you make to what you received, you have to license under the reciprocal license. So this is really good for software libraries, for OEM strategies, where you want to make it possible for people to put it into their proprietary software, but you want to make sure that the actual thing that you give is preserved as an open source license, and maybe you follow a dual license strategy or whatever your goals are, but it only applies to that specific binary, that library that you're distributing. Now, Tyler, you and I have gone through those 3 licenses a couple of times. Any questions about that, those 3 varieties of open source licenses?
No, I think the definitions you provided are pretty succinct. I'm interested in understanding a little bit better the difference between the GPL and the LGPL, because those get conflated a lot. They get mixed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a third variety, which is the AGPL, which I don't have on this slide. So it's all about when you trigger the share alike clause. So if I give you code under a share alike license, you have to share any improvements you make under the same license. And the GPL says that happens if you incorporate it into a derivative work. And so that depends on your legal jurisdiction, what the jury decides a derivative work is. But it's normally explained that if you link it into your software. So if I have a GPL library and I put it into my much larger proprietary application, I have to open source the entire larger proprietary application. Now, if you look at like the Linux kernel, they see that as the kernel. So if I build so I can't build a proprietary device driver that plugs into Linux kernel because that license would apply to the device driver. I can write a proprietary application on top of the kernel that interacts through the public API, the kernel system calls. The Linux community has decided that is not a derivative work, that those are two separate works, and it really depends on the project. And that's what makes it so confusing, and what makes a lot of businesses concerned about the GPL is that they don't have a precise understanding of that boundary, because it's determined by a jury. You know, you have to sue and figure out where the jury decides is derivative work.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but there haven't been any notable court cases around the GPL clarifications. That,
There have been some on the GPL. Now there's a newer version. So the GPL is very clear to say it's where it's that derivative work of a single software package. Now, but there are a lot of companies that say, hey, so I can take that GPL code and I can host my web service and everybody can interact with it over the internet and I don't have to give anything back because I never actually distributed it. And the AGPL says, no, no, no. If people are accessing it, I said that poorly. The other thing that triggers the distribution of your source code is when you redistribute it. If you're using it internal to your organization, then the GPL doesn't apply. You haven't redistributed. You're free. The GPL lets you, the share alike provision doesn't apply. The GPL lets you use it however you want within your organization. It's only when you share it that you have to give those rights to your user. So if you incorporate it into your product and then ship it to a third party, that's what triggers. The AGPL says, no, it's not just when you ship it to a third party. If you deliver it over the internet or give access to it over the internet, then you've triggered that redistribution, and that larger work that includes the network access, that's all supposed to be open source. And that's what's got people even more concerned because it's a bigger blast radius per se. And exactly where that extends, nobody knows because it's never been tried in court. So when you talk about the AGPL, a lot of companies say, look, we might be okay with Linux and the GPL, but we can't touch the AGPL at all because it's just very vague. And it was written to be vague. It was written to be maximally reciprocal to, and that's made it really hard for people to use. The LGPL goes the other direction. It says that derivative work doesn't extend beyond the actual application you received. So if I give you, the Mozilla Firefox, the Mozilla public license has a similar goal. So Firefox is a browser. When you receive Firefox, if you improve Firefox, you're committed to redistribute those improvements. But if you write an extension to Firefox, if you use Firefox inside your own application, all those things, when you ship it to your customer, you have to say, by the way, these parts of it are Firefox and the source code's available here. The rest of it is ours and we don't have to give you anything. So it's a much narrower blast radius per se of where you have to share again. Does that make sense?
I think that's much more clear. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent question, thank you. So the source available side are non-open source licenses. And what we find is that a lot of companies have said, look, I want the benefits of open source. I like sharing. I like giving freedoms to my users. I like letting people adopt in a freemium style with no sales process. But for various reasons, I'm struggling with these open source models. The Apache license makes it really easy for a giant hosting provider to take all of my stuff and not contribute back. That's very scary to me. It could sink my investors' investment. The share alike provisions are very frustrating to businesses and scare them away, so it hurts adoption. Or it's frustrating to my ecosystem because of the dual license strategy they don't like. Or I spend all this time arguing around where that open core line is, which parts are going to be open source, which parts are going to be proprietary. So there's some new licenses that were created that try and meet a different goal here. And the first one is time-based. And so I create a separate slide for this. That the creator of MySQL came up with this idea. He said, look, he followed the dual license strategy of everything's GPL'd, and then I can sell proprietary licenses if people don't want the GPL. He followed that until they sold to Oracle, and then he started a new company, MariaDB, but he couldn't be the exclusive copyright holder because Oracle held the previous stuff. And he said, look, really what we want is we just need a period of time where we can build our business, recoup the cost of our R&D investment. That's pretty fair. And then sure, let people use it. Let it be open source. And so he created a business source license to do that. The first version had some concerns. The second version, Bruce Perens, the creator of the open source definition, or one of the founders of the open source initiative, he actually endorsed it. He says, yeah, I think this is a pretty good way to ensure people can recoup their R&D investment in open source, well, and maximize total open source in the world, giving rights to their user. And it's called a parameterized license, meaning in software, you can insert your own pieces to customize functionality. So the two parameters are the restriction. So the BSL says you can do anything you want with this license within the following restriction. And then you as a business can insert that restriction. So MariaDB's restriction is you can't cluster. So if you don't need a cluster, you can use it, no problem. You can redistribute it, you can change it, you can do whatever you want, but you can't cluster. And the second thing you insert is when it changes to an open source license. And anything that is under the business source license has a maximum time limit of 4 years, and then it converts to an open source license. So if you do, so MariaDB as an example, after 4 years, it converts to be GPL'd. And that's just the way it is. So anytime you use open source MariaDB stuff, you know what you're currently using. 4 years from that point in time, at the most, it will be available under a GPL license. And there's some other people who picked up on this. They use 3 years, 3.5 years, and they convert to Apache or something else. But if it's BSL, you know, sure, it's proprietary, but source available for a period of time. But eventually, you get all the rights of open source. And that's a good way to compromise on how do I build a sustainable business? How do I continue investing in this ecosystem? And still, how do I guarantee those freedoms to my users? Now, there's another approach that's the all rights accept. So these ones don't ever convert to another license. Instead, they say, look, we are nervous about the GPL because people don't like where that sharing gets determined. And so we're going to draw that sharing line differently. And the Confluent Community License, it says, look, you can do anything you want except for host a competing service. So they're just carving out one specific competitor there. And Mongo, they actually had an AGPL model. So they said, look, you can't use the AGPL, or you can't, you have to share alike if you redistribute, allow access over a network. But people are too concerned. They felt like that was reducing adoption because it was too vague. So they said, look, no, we'll treat it like the GPL, but also include this concept of you can't host a competing service, a competing SaaS service. And so in that way, it's a little more liberal than the AGPL. It provides less requirements to reciprocate, but the same opportunities to reuse as the GPL, unless you're trying to do a very specific business model with it. So it's not open source, it's not free software because it doesn't guarantee that freedom to do whatever you want. But for most practical use cases, it actually gives you fewer restrictions than the traditional AGPL model that they had used. So that's the all rights accept approach. Any questions about time-based or all rights accept?
I think those are straightforward. Any notable differences between the CCL and SSPL that should be mentioned?
Yeah, the key thing to recognize is in this category, the BSL is pretty standard. You insert the customization for your company. All the others here are very much about a specific project. So Confluent, their license is written specifically about what they want to restrict for their business. The server-side public license is intended to be adopted by lots of people, but I haven't seen it adopted by other projects. But it just says we are GPL'd with the exception that you cannot host a competing service. So those two are the CCL has no well, I shouldn't, I think it has, no, you can't relicense CCL code. Um, so you do have to distribute derivatives under the same license. So there, each one of these, and I made a list of like 10 of these. There are a bunch of these different all rights except, but those are the two best known. And they're two that are specifically packaged so you could reuse them if you wanted to. And then the third category is the way Elastic took, and a few others have taken this, where they said, look, we have this open core model. We have some things that are proprietary, some things that are open, but we want to make sure that people have a lot of these benefits of open source with the proprietary side. So we're going to make sure when we distribute to maximize adoption, we're going to make sure that people get the proprietary stuff along with the open source stuff. So if you go to elastic.com and you download Elastic, by default, you're going to get a bundle of proprietary Elastic stuff in that deliverable. That annoyed some people who are really worried about the open source licensing. And so Elastic does give you an option to download just the open source bits, and they make it really clear in that bundle which parts are proprietary and which parts are open. But the proprietary stuff is under the Elastic license, and the Elastic license says, you can't host a competing service, you can't do various things. It has a whole list. It's a proprietary license, even though they distribute the source code. And that's how they try to maximize the flexibility on the adoption side for their customers, while still, and it generates enough revenue to grow a really, the open source only Elastic is pretty awesome. So that's how they've drawn that line to try and strike that balance between, yes, the proprietary stuff doesn't feel very proprietary because the source is available, but the open source, it is an open core model. The open source stuff is not everything. So those are some licenses you can use in that arsenal of how do I build my open source business. Let's talk about another lever we can use, and that is project control. Community, a traditional open source project is usually community governed. Think of Apache projects, Hyperledger projects, Linux Foundation. These have clear governance by which anybody can participate on an equal footing, and multiple copyright holders, the multiple people hold the copyright, which makes it hard to relicense. Anyone can merge if they prove that the merge if they show that the merge meets the requirements, the specification. There's a community consensus process that allows you to determine how to proceed when there's disagreement. And that's really great for broad adoption. This consortium model is really powerful in building long-lived, healthy open source ecosystems, but it has some negatives. It's slow. There's a lot of arguments around that consensus. It's often not very well focused on a user because everybody wants their bell and whistle included, and they usually get it. Whoever writes the most code wins. So big companies can often dominate because they can invest more developers. And it's susceptible to the tragedy of the commons. Nobody wants to write documentation. Nobody wants to do manual testing. Nobody wants to maintain the systems that everybody else is using. So you get a lack of polish there. Some of these ecosystems have managed to overcome a lot of that, but the majority of community governed projects struggle in these areas. The alternative is you say, we're a business, we have an open source project, but we're in charge because it's our business and it's our project. So you've got a single copyright holder, so you can relicense. That allows you to invest. You have restricted merge rights. I'm only going to accept the merges that I want from my customers. It's my corporate vision, and I'm going to do the things that are best for the people I'm selling to. And that customer focus is a big benefit. The customer who's implementing this usually doesn't care about the governance of the upstream project. They care about how it meets their needs. And hopefully they care that it preserves their freedoms, the 4 freedoms of free software. And so a company controlled project can do that quite well. Of course, the same benefits are the negatives. It's narrow set of use cases. If you don't agree with that corporate vision, you got to fork. But the beauty of open source, the beauty of free software is you have that right to fork. So you get all the benefits of open source to you if you decide you want to go take that to your community consortium governance. But if the company is a good steward, then you also benefit as a user of that project by that company investing a lot of time and energy in improving it for your use case. So that
Another,
spectrum. Oh, go ahead.
another con to note with corporate governance model is you'll probably struggle to get more adoption and contributions. Where a community governance, those typically can spread a lot faster and get a lot more
Yeah,
contributors.
that's exactly right. And actually, I should have had a bullet point for that, because that is exactly right. The average contributors might say, hey, I don't want to contribute to your corporate vision, so why would I contribute to your project? At the same time, is you build your business with corporate governance, your partners and customers, often they're aligned with your corporate vision. They're often very incentivized to contribute in a way that they wouldn't to a more generic project. And
Right.
so
So it
you get
can
a
be a
different
very
mix.
it can be a very strategic tool if you know that your business, like your market, is a specific market where you have high confidence that you'll have, I don't want to say captive, but you'll have loyal customers that would be serious about a long-term relationship with your business, such that they would invest, to contribute to your project, and that the fact that it's a corporate governance where you hold the license, you could relicense at any time, that wouldn't scare them. So it's a strategic tool.
Exactly right. And so this tool is independent of what license you pick. You can, companies like Microsoft and Apple have done great at proprietary business models, proprietary source code that still enables lots of partners and customers to contribute, because they have all these agreements and they have this ecosystem and they have this community. But it's so much easier to do that when you just open source the code. And so corporate governance can be, a single company can control the code and still have a vibrant ecosystem of contributors and partners. But to your point, it's going to be a very different set of a different kind of ecosystem. It's going to be people who are all focused on that use case of that commercial product. You're not going to have the diverse set of stakeholders and the clear governance. I mean, it's clear, but the democratic governance or meritocratic governance of an Apache or a Hyperledger project. A good example of this is Pivotal. Pivotal helped set up the Cloud Foundry project, which is a community-governed project for hosting SaaS infrastructure, creating SaaS infrastructure, I should say. And they participate in that. When you talk to their management team, they talk about the challenge of competing against IBM's and Red Hat's, these major and of course that's the same company now, but competing in a consortium on an equal footing with these giant companies can be really hard. And but they also have Spring Boot, and Spring Boot is an Apache licensed, so completely liberal gift style license project, but it's controlled exclusively by Pivotal. And so what they find is when people are if they're only going to do Cloud Foundry, then they've got a selection of vendors to pick from. But if they're going to do Java Cloud Foundry, well, Spring Boot makes Java so much easier. So let's use Pivotal because they've got a project targeted to our needs, Spring Boot, and they've got they can help with the infrastructure with the PaaS, platform as a service, so Cloud Foundry. And so it gives Pivotal a competitive advantage because they've mixed those two governance models with separate projects that are both liberally open source licensed, but it presents a very powerful revenue engine for them. Any other comments on project control?
No, I think that's great.
So last topic, we talked about the license, which sets the stage of the rules that your community is going to use to contribute and to reuse the software based on, let me rephrase that. The license determines how your community will reuse the software and contribute to the software. So it sets those incentives. And then we talked about control, which determines what are the rules by which people contribute and what are those incentives. And then the other tool is, where do you draw the line? Do you want to have everything open? Do you want to have just the core stuff, contribute the core stuff to the consortium and have other stuff proprietary or open under a different model? Or do you have specific niches that are open and specific niches that are closed? That is where that open core differentiation comes in. And this is really hard. Every team I've been on that have tried to draw this line has struggled with it. If you draw this line well, then your open source adopters are going to feel like you're providing uh, all the tools they need for their use cases. They have strong incentive to grow your ecosystem and to contribute back. And if you draw it well, your customers are going to feel like they have, like there's no vendor lock-in, that they have a reasonable alternative in the open source ecosystem. But you also have customers feel like, yes, what we're paying for is valuable enough to be worth the license fee. When I started selling open source, I was very naive and I thought, people will value the freedom and they will buy. In practice, the person I was talking to valued the freedom and wanted to buy, but they had to go through a procurement officer who didn't give a hoot about the freedom and needed a checkbox that said, this is what we're paying for. And so there were some things we need to reserve to get through procurement. And that's the way it was. And got beat into me time after time, is you're trying to get your quota for the quarter. So when I was trying to do this at a previous team, I ended up interviewing a couple hundred of our open source contributors and customers, people who had looked at the open source and looked at the proprietary and made a decision. And I asked them, well, why did you decide to stay with the open source? Why did you decide to pick the proprietary? And we found there's a really clear line around scalability, that people who pick the proprietary often needed scalability requirements. They had a certain set of users that were put them out of the small business tier. And people who prefer the open source usually were in that small business tier, the vast majority of them. So many that the ones that weren't seemed irrelevant to the ecosystem. And I talked to some of these people that were installing our open source code at their customer sites. They were consultants. And I said, when do you decide to refer them to us as the vendor? And one of them said, look, when it gets above a certain number of users, then they start calling me on the weekends. They start worrying about downtime. That's when I'd rather you handled support instead of me. And we saw, that's great. So we drew the line right there. And people like this guy would go out and sell would install our open source package. And when it grew big enough, they'd come to us for support and clustering and scalability. And it was really happy. And that line proved really robust for about 10 years. And then cloud came along. And as you move to cloud, scalability is kind of free. And it blew our whole open core differentiation out of the water. We had to rethink the whole thing. And that's the challenge, is if you're careful about it, then you find a lot of alignment between your open source ecosystem and your upsell engine. And if you're not careful about it, then you create so much friction that you get the worst of all worlds, because you don't have the clean model of proprietary, because you're always arguing about where the line should be, but you don't have anybody contributing on the open source side or adopting on the open source side because they don't trust you. You can move this line over time. If you're clear with your community, if you respect the incentives of the open source ecosystem that is contributing, you can move that line to ensure a sustainable business, because people will see that they benefit from your contributions. But you got to do it carefully. You got to do it slowly. If you do it too often, if you undermine confidence in you as a contributor, if people feel like their contributions are just going to end up behind your paywall, then you've blown up your open source ecosystem. You might as well not have an open source model. So the way to think about that is, it's that balance. Open source, we want to give everything away, maximize adoption, easy. So you're looking for things that are easy to implement, that commodities, and it can grow over time. On the proprietary side, you're looking for things that have that are driving adoption, so they're worth a lot. But you also need to look for things that have a high technical hurdle. If you try to commercialize things that are easy, then you've just created friction, a competitive situation with your open source community. If you try to, and if it's something that everybody needs, it's too broad, then you've destroyed adoption, because nobody wants to use the open source piece without that feature. And so you're looking for something niche enough that not everybody needs it, but important enough that people want to pay for it, and hard enough that nobody's going to go to the effort of doing it without you. without, it's easier to just pay for it than to do it themselves. If you can find that line, and if it's consistent for your business, you can build a very successful open core business where you get all the benefits of freedom. You provide a clean experience for your users, the benefits of freedom with very little vendor lock-in or no vendor lock-in. But if you get the line wrong, then things get messy. And that's where people really tried to create those time-based open source models, or those source available models, because they saw this friction of trying to draw that line and said, yeah, that's just not worth it. If we just say, look, it's ours for a period of time, then then everybody knows what the rules are. There's no arguing, and everybody gets the benefits of where things are going to end up. So that's how you can trade this tool against some of the others. Any questions about open core differentiation?
I think it's a good overview.
Well, thanks, Tyler, for prompting me to do this. It went a little longer than expected, but I think it captures well the tools that people can use as they build that business model, and it'll help people understand as Evernym goes through this process what our thinking was as we figure out the right strategy for each of our products.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard.
Excellent. Let's see, where's my record button? So I'll stop the recording. Thanks.